Welcome, everyone, to the WriteHive Heroic Villains and Villainous Heroes panel. I'm here with three fantastic individuals. I'm here with Andy Peloquin, who is a prolific author with over 40 books published in both fantasy and science fiction. He loves to explore the darker side of human nature through his fiction, so I think that it'll be really useful for this conversation. K.D. Edwards is an urban fantasy writer from North Carolina. He's the author of the Tarot Sequence, and the second of which is The Hanged Man, came out September 2019. And lastly, but not least, Jessie Pullman is a science fiction fantasy author from Long Island, New York. His novels Protostar and the Physics Incarnate series can be found on Amazon, and in his free time, he likes to write political articles about gerrymandering, I saw. All right, everyone, so I think that we are ready.
I just have to correct. I don't have 40 novels yet.
Oh, my mistake.
It's 24 now. Hopefully by the end of the year or early next year, I'll hit 40, but not quite yet.
Oh, so 24. Oh, my bad. Totally not prolific at all then. No.
I didn't want to take, more credit than I was due for the work that I've put in, I mean, some of the books are like as long as 2 or 3 novels, so, we could stretch the truth a little bit, but
So, to start off our conversation, I think it'd be useful for us to define some terms here at the beginning. These are kind of really abstract concepts and are a little bit subjective to some people. So for you guys personally, what makes a hero and what makes a villain? Feel free to jump in, whoever wants to go first.
Sure. Well, heroism is something that you do. It's some sort of sacrifice that you give of yourself. It's something that you're taking a risk, be it your time, be it your energy, be it your life. Villain is a little harder to describe, I think, because everyone's got their own nuances to the term. It's easy to envision a hero. It's not so easy to envision something that's less than larger than life.
That's pretty solid. I like your focus on what they do for heroes, about the actions that they take.
I like playing with villains versus antagonists. I'm okay with heroes, but villains and the darker side are sort of my specialty. So villains and antagonists, those are something that really need to be distinguished. Villain, but take the most basic definition in the dictionary, and it is someone whose motives or actions are evil, right? It's evil. And there's actually not so many evil character types. You've got someone like a sadist, right? They're pretty straight up evil. You've got someone like a bully who can often fall into the more misunderstood, but often, when the act of bullying, of hurting someone else, inflicting pain, isn't itself evil. Then you've got like forces of actual evil, like the more the supernatural, demonic kind that are just bred to bring evil into the world, right? Or the ancient forces like Cthulhu, who by destroying everything and bringing about chaos, it is evil to us as human beings, right? So there's actually very few evil characters. So pretty much everybody else falls into the category of antagonist. An antagonist can be literally anybody, and this is what I love about it, is that you can turn any hero into an antagonist just by shifting perspective. So this antagonism becomes a matter of perspective. As a great example, in my Queen of Thieves series, the main character is a thief, kind of says it in the title. So who do you think the antagonist of the piece is? It's Law and Order. The guy who is her main rival is actually a good guy, right? The whole book is all about him trying to bring order to the city, but because he's going up against her, he's the bad guy of the piece. He's the antagonist. So an antagonist can be anyone and anything, and that gives it so much more scope and so much more complexity that we get to play with as authors, because all you have to do is change the perspective of the character or give the character a perspective and then set someone against them. And that's all it takes to make an antagonist.
So the term antagonist is removed from hero and villain.
Exactly. You can have the noblest, most honorable person in the world be the antagonist, just like you can have a total asshole be the protagonist. And that's where a lot of people, they think about villains and heroes in sort of this black and white. But in the end, it comes down to whose perspective am I the author writing from, or you the reader reading from? That's what decides who's the good or bad person in the story. Like if you looked at any one of the Marvel Comics movies, like take Doctor Doom, right? If you read Doctor Doom's story, he totally thinks he's not the good guy, but he is the savior of Latveria, right? He is the one who is bringing order to the chaos. He is the one that's making the world a better place by being a total dictator and kind of a dick most of the time. But because we're from the perspective of the Fantastic Four, he's the bad guy. Now, if there have been, stories set from Doom's perspective, and it totally changes things. And so it's really fun to play with that, because it comes down to tiny little nuances, whether it's one decision that separates the main protagonist character from the antagonist. They're not even villains. They're just the one choice sends them in the opposite path and they end up clashing. That's all it is.
KD, what about you?
I'm just having a good time listening to what, make sure I don't have my mute button pressed here. I'm a bit of a baby writer, and I'm still trying to find my own way with how I define things in my stories. I mean, I know that to a certain extent, my perspective is really blunt. My hero that's the person I'm writing about, and the villain is a person going up against my hero. I think one of the things that I've been most surprised about after having published 2 novels, but particularly following reader reviews of how people react to my heroes and my villains, are this sense of how much nuance there is, and everything we've been talking about, how what you could perceive as heroic could come from a rather dark place, and then vice versa. My first novel, I tried to make much more of a nuanced type villain, someone who you could understand. And my second novel, I just went all out like black hat villain, like traditional, like basically tie the innocent characters to the railroad track sort of villainy, and so see how people responded to that. In particular, that was another kind of eye-opening experience for me. I think, for me, my definitions, I react to what my readers are reacting to, and they've kind of taught me a lot about it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. Could you speak on that reader reaction a little bit more, about how people responded to a more nuanced villain and then a more traditional archetypal villain?
I think the thing that surprised me the most, because this is something that I've always really believed in. Like, I've read every single reader review of my books, and they tell you, as a writer, a lot of people will say just that is the last thing that you should be doing if you want to preserve your sanity. But I've actually, for the most part, my reviews are really good. And even when they have critical things to say, a lot of it's couched in really complimentary terms. But one of the things they said about book 2 is that I made this really archetype bad guy villain. And they loved it. For some reason, they really liked the idea that there was no shades of gray between the hero and the villain. It was incredibly defined in book 2, whereas it hadn't been as much in book 1. And I thought that kind of said something really interesting, because maybe about 5 or 10 years ago, I think you would have found the opposite reaction. And it's it comes in cycles and waves of what's received well amongst readership, both TV and books.
The truth is that we all love the more nuanced villains, but there's something to be said about just a straight up bastard that you want to see them die in the end. Like Thanos, they tried to make him, that more nuanced. They tried to walk that line with him, and I, for one, found it intriguing. But at the same time, it diminished a little bit of the Thanos is coming sort of doom and destruction feel of it all that they had built up until that one. It didn't ruin the story for me, because Thanos was a sufficiently well-crafted villain to make him interesting. But up until that very moment, it was like, holy shit, Thanos is coming. And so that's kind of the difference, I think, when you do the villains that are more nuanced and complex, is that they're less terrifying in their ominousness, but they are more terrifying in just how relatable they are. Like, there but for the grace of God go I, in a way. Mm-hmm. You can understand how they got from where they started out to where they are now, and you can pretty much imagine, sort of like with the new Joker movie. You followed him on that journey, and by the end, you were a little bit guilty, because you could kind of understand why he did what he did. So that's what's great about those complex villains. Now, a straight up villain like, the Emperor Palpatine, there's no subtlety, there's no nuance. He's just a bad guy doing bad things that you want to see him die at the end, and it's happy. There's room for all these kinds of villains and antagonists.
This is really interesting. Yeah, sorry. Go Jesse. No, go.
I like the way you brought motive into it, because motive does make a difference, and I think you gotta look at it like this. Somebody's motive may be villainous to somebody else. If you've got a police officer whose motive is to protect his family, what happens when his family is accused of a crime? Does the police officer go ahead and do something surreptitious to throw some doubt into the mix and maybe get their family off on a technicality? You know, these little things can make for great narratives while you're still preserving a sense of this person's still a good guy. They're just doing a thing that's not so good because they've got a motivation. I mean, you talk about Thanos. I personally am in the camp of if you've got an Infinity Glove, you don't have a resource problem to manage, but that's just a grand strategy game player talking. I could be wrong, and I could just not know the rules of the Infinity Glove. Maybe to create, you must destroy, and he can't create all the infinite resources, so he has to destroy some of the stuff too. I don't know, but the original story was probably a little more nuanced because for him it was just love that drove him.
I like to define it by four pillars essentially of good versus evil. It's motive, action, outcome, and reaction. So let's say someone let's play with your example of the police officer. The police officer, his desire is to protect his family, right? That's his motive, right? His action is shooting someone. Puts him a little bit more on the villainous side of things, right? Now, if it just so happens that the outcome is that the guy he shot was a drug dealer, right? Okay, kind of pushes him back the other way. But then how does he react to it? Does he cover it up and bury the body, or does he say, he reports it? So all four of these things, if any one of them are good or bad, it's sort of trying to ascribe morality to something that is incredibly complex. So it's hard to reduce it to good versus bad. But any action that can be defined as either morally good or bad, any motive, any outcome, and then any reaction. If those things aren't sort of aligned in one way or the other, that's when you start to see, okay, is he a good person or is he a bad person? Not necessarily based on just their motive or just their action, because you can see people like the Punisher. The Punisher falls right down the middle because his action is terrible, killing people, but his motives, not so bad. So you can play with those four things are kind of a way that we all human beings can sort of judge ourselves in life, the things that we do, the circumstances we find ourselves in, as good or bad. And then as authors, it's how we can follow that through, and infuse it into our stories by judging it based on those four things.
That was very well put.
I've talked about this subject a lot, in case that wasn't clear.
No, not at all. I had no way of knowing. So you all bring up very interesting points about where the intersection of good and evil, heroes and villains, it's all about perspective, it's all about who it is. So when you bring up the idea of the anti-hero into the mix, which is something that's very, very popular recently, it's proliferated a lot into all forms of culture, from The Punisher to Walter White in Breaking Bad, and you can just keep going, keep finding the lists. Why did you close, phone? So, is that what an anti-hero is? Someone who is doing something good for the wrong reasons, or is doing something bad for the right reasons? Where do you find that an anti-hero is, and how do you portray that through not just making them snarky and have funny quips?
I think one of the things that you at least need to be really, really careful about when you're doing an anti-hero, and I definitely want to hear what everyone else has to say, because you guys have put a lot of thought into your answers, and I'm kind of blown away by some of the stuff you're making me think about. But one of the things I know with anti-heroes, and you're right, the whole snarkiness, especially in the face of authority, can get overdone really quickly. But I've done a lot of critique groups. In addition to being a writer, I've been in writing groups for about 10 or 15 years now. And one of the things that's most commonly pointed out with anti-heroes is you've got to preserve some sense of sympathy. You've got to have the reader find some sort of bond to make them feel sympathetic towards that anti-hero, or it's not going to go off the page very well. That's my greatest learning, at least when it comes to anti-heroes, and the thing that I try to pay attention to.
So sympathy, you bring that up. How do you personally make your anti-hero sympathetic?
I can think of better examples of when I've seen it not go well. I've seen people do stories where it's like focusing on the perspective of a bank robber, and really the whole cast of characters is people from the criminal underworld. But the problem was the main character and his main cohort. There was absolutely nothing redeemable about them. There was nothing. The damage that had been done to them wasn't so great that you felt sympathetic for it. The way they go about it, the people they associate with, the dialogue they use, the actions, none of that made you feel any sense of comfort around those characters. It was really hard to get into the story because of that.
You know what your comment about bank robber made me think of? The Inside Job. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie with Clive Owen as the bank robber, and I think it's Denzel Washington as the detective. And obviously Clive Owen has, his Clive Owen charm and all of that. But at the beginning, he's a bank robber, right? He's holding people hostage. He's doing terrible things. He's robbing a bank. But then slowly through the course of the movie, you see the things that sort of shift him from the perspective of villain to not necessarily even anti-hero, but he's not quite a villain. By the end of the movie, you find out that the stuff that he's stealing is from bad people that had happened, terrible things that happened. So he was stealing from sort of not quite a Robin Hood, but it was playing a little bit in that direction. And he never actually hurt anybody and all of these things. So by the end of the movie, they've given you these little bits and pieces that make you say, it's okay what he's doing, or it's less bad than I initially thought. And by building on that, by the end of the movie, when he walks out scot-free, his last action, the last thing he does in the movie, you're a little bit like, okay, I get it. I'm cool with everything that just happened because of the way it was structured. And that's how anti-heroes are done best, is when you show both aspects of them, both their humanity and their inhumanity. I don't know if it's bad to bring it back to my books, but my character, the Hunter of Aramis from the Hero of Darkness series, is a half-demon assassin with the cursed dagger that drives him to kill, right? These are all quintessential villain traits, pretty much. He's a bad guy, right? In the beginning, in the first chapter, the opening scene, he kills somebody. A chapter later, he drops 3 more bodies. So, we're talking a lot of carnage. So pretty much the bad guy right away. But then he walks into the building that he owns, and you find out that there are beggars and, lepers and people like that living there, that he's brought them in. And so he shows empathy towards them. There's a kid who has a skin disease, and he thinks, I got to buy them bandages. There's an old woman who's dying, and he's like, I got to make sure she's got blankets before the winter comes. Just things like that. So you got dead bodies, and then you got a little bit of humanity. And then he goes and he drops more bodies, but then there's another little thing of humanity. And so slowly you build on these things. You reel the reader in with both the badass stuff that they get away with doing as anti-heroes, but then what makes them empathetic, what makes them people that you, the reader, can care about. And slowly building on that until you've taken their 50% villainy and 50% heroism, and you've made it 51% heroism and 49% villainy. And that's all you need to do. Obviously, you've got to make it a well-crafted character. But as long as you can keep the villain or the anti-hero on that 51% side heroism, and he never strays too far into villainy without pulling himself back or recovering, then it's okay. The reader will continue to see him as an anti-hero as opposed to sort of a villain character that you're trying unsuccessfully to bring back and make them love.
Nice.
Yeah, so one of my favorite anti-heroes, and it fits very much the mold you were just talking about, Andy, is Guts from Berserk. He's framed initially as borderline psychopathic, in the sense that he's out fighting evil, but he's really just doing it for himself, and anyone he saves along the way or fails to save along the way is just collateral to his wake. He's passing through, he's causing chaos, and that's it. That's all there is to it. But as the story goes on, you A, discover why he's like that, and B, as he starts to finally build new connections in his new life after the eclipse, he's very much much more forgiving, much more patient, willing to teach people his skills. And he goes from being that sort of in-between, very dark and brooding and grim, to being much more noble. And you can see how this guy was once a hero, and now he's becoming one again. I like to contrast that really quickly to Mercedes Lackey's books in the Valdemar series. If you've ever read Magic's Pawn, Daniel is just a noob mage. I mean, he's really new at this. He got these gifts foisted on him late in life. He's barely got any skills. And he's up against this powerful magician who's being really sweet to him, trying to seduce him, trying to make him think like, oh, we could be really great together. And Daniel reaches into the guy's mind and he says, is there anything here that gives me a sense that this person is redeemable, that I can make this person into not a bad guy and save him? And he's met with what exactly this villain learned his powers from, what kind of darkness he has in his soul. And he goes, nope, and boom, vaporizes him. So I think that's kind of a good contrast, because Guts, if Daniel had looked into Guts' soul, he would have seen what happened and been like, there's a guy here to save. Versus this wizard Kerbane who's just evil and twisted and out for dark things, and boom, done.
It's all really interesting. You guys are focusing on the actions that they take, which I think is important, because that's actions define what a person is, not necessarily what they think of themselves. What do you think that has a role to play in anything, how people view themselves? Because obviously everyone's the hero of their own story, as you were talking about it before. Do you think that a person who does objectively villainous actions, if they realize that they're a bad person, say, for example, You, the Joe Goldberg from the TV show You, or the book You, he is very conscious of the fact that he's doing bad things sometimes, but he doesn't stop doing them.
For me, that makes him a straight up villain, because when you get to that moment of realization, that is the crucible moment when you have to decide which way you're going. Like, you can have people who I don't like the saying every villain's the hero of their own story, because it reduces it to simple sense of morality. For me, it's more about desire, like whatever the character wants, and then what they're willing to do to achieve it. And so if the character, maybe they don't give a shit about being a hero or a villain, they're just like, I want money, so I'm going to do whatever it takes to get it. Or maybe they want power, or maybe they want revenge, or whatever it is. You know, again, it comes down to the motive, action, outcome, and reaction. That reaction is super critical, because if they find out, holy shit, I am killing tens of thousands of people by my actions, and they don't do anything, or I just killed someone, or I got someone killed, and they don't choose to pull themselves back, or to change their ways, or to sort of step back in the direction of hero, they take another step farther into villainy. And that's what makes a villain in the end, is the people who, I feel like that's the worst kind of villain, the ones who come face to face with the truth of what their actions are doing to other people, or to the world around them, and they don't change it, or they're just like, well, it's, I'm getting what I want. That is what firmly cements them in the path of villainy. If they ever, have that, the come to Jesus moment, and they repent and they try to, turn themselves around, even if they've made 1,000 wrong choices, as long as they take that last one, it sets them back on the path towards being more hero/anti-hero. But as long as they're going down that path toward villainy and consciously making that decision, in a way that's almost worse than someone who's kind of, let's say, killing people out of some PTSD or some neurological condition that is affecting their brain. People who are consciously making the choice.
Jesse, KD, do you have anything to contrast, add?
No, not on that. I mean, I think those are just relatively incredible comments. The only thing I wanted to add to the discussion about the anti-hero in particular, because I've been thinking about it, listening to what you guys are talking about, and especially what you talked about the snark. That's something I keep on going back to, because that's usually a point where I usually break with a lot of enjoyment of reading, when it becomes unbelievable when it's employed. Or like you kind of project yourself into it. There are certain, and I'm going to be honest, the best time to bring a plug for your laptop is when you're doing a webinar with 4 other people. And I didn't think about doing that, but apparently my computer does not like video conferencing, because it's going down by like 2% every second.
Yikes.
But before, I'll grab a cord in a second. I'll be right back on. But one of the things I wanted to add to that is I love when there's consequence to things like that. Think about in your life, like how often when you an authority figure says something stupid, you actually say what you think to that authority figure. It doesn't usually happen in real life. But the best books I've read, like there's this vampire series called The Joe Pitt Vampire by Charlie Houston. He's just an incredible writer. And whenever Joe Pitt mouths off at someone he shouldn't have, something happens. And it's a consequence of the entire series. Like they'll eat one of his fingers or something like that. And he's missing a finger for the rest of the entire series. That's the sort of thing that I've really enjoyed bringing into, if I'm going to do an anti-hero that has snark, I like to balance it with moments when he actually knows when to hold his tongue and when not, or when he doesn't hold his tongue, what are the real consequences of something like that? That's how I associate with an anti-hero. I'm going to grab a cord. I'll be right back.
Snark deployed as a manipulative tool.
Very much.
like sassy heroines who kind of snark off for no reason. It kind of ruins the character because it makes them very superficial. But hey, I love writing a sassy, snarky heroine as much as the next guy. So in order to do that and make it real, it was like, all right, now this guy, he's going to make a stupid decision if he gets mad. So I'm going to sass off and piss him off, knowing that he's going to make a stupid decision, or use it as a tool of manipulation, or to throw him off balance, or whatever it is. Use it for a purpose. Every single thing the character does or says has to matter. And anything that's just kind of thrown in there to be cool, or, to keep up with a trope or genre expectations, if it's not done right, it falls flat, and that leads to the kind of story that readers are like, like it was fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of when it comes to snarky stuff, I guess I'm guilty of that sin a little bit, but that's okay. I think everyone does at some point. Sometimes it provides for like a nice moment of levity. I love the idea of consequences for that sort of thing, and it brings me around, and this whole talk of hero, anti-hero, villain, protagonist, and antagonist brings me to Venture Brothers, where, there's a whole guild of bad guys, except you don't really want to call them bad guys unless you're one of them, because if you're not, they'll take offense to it. They'll be like, what do you mean I'm a bad guy? I'm just an antagonist. I'm just the person opposed to this hero. That's all. When in reality, they're perfectly happy being bad guys, and they recognize themselves as supervillains. They just, don't call me that. But I am. But don't call me it. But I am. But don't call me it.
or like from Wreck-It Ralph, where it's like, just because I'm a bad guy doesn't mean I have to be a bad guy.
Yeah.
Right. And it allows for layers to the character. Like, yes, they're a supervillain, but they still have feelings. They're still very much, generally speaking, humans. So they still have end goals that might not be necessarily villainous, and they might make choices that a hero would make, self-sacrificial, in order to bolster their own goals, even if those goals might be a little, what's the word? Villainous. Yeah.
So you guys brought up a really interesting point about consequences, in regarding to snark specifically, but I think it's a wider point to be made when we're talking about anti-heroes and villains doing bad things. In a long period of American history, for movies specifically, there's this thing called the Hays Code, which made so that anything that was negative, like gangster movies, any gangster had to be punished by the end of the film. While we no longer have that, and we have a much grayer idea of what is good and what is bad, I'm hesitant to use the word responsibility, because art is art. But what do you think is the best way to go about representing something objectively villainous that a character does? Like we were talking about before, murder, or even in a more subtle way, something in regards to like sexism or racism, or things we wouldn't find necessarily good about good people. What do you think those consequences, how do you balance those out?
Oh, I know I was actually thinking about this earlier when we were talking about like the point where you tip from like 49% to 51%. When it comes to touching on really sensitive areas, such as especially diversity areas, I mean, I'm sure if you're a writer, you followed a lot of the controversies over the last couple of years where an author's come out with something and it's touched on a controversial issue, and how the author handled that controversial issue sometimes becomes a whole nother controversy in itself. Specifically when you have a bad guy who, their redemption is part of the development act, but whether that point of redemption comes too late in the novel or at the end of the novel, sometimes there's a lot of fault assigned to that. It's something that I've been kind of puzzling through on my own. It's a really profound, a perspective that we have. And I think it's great that we have it, that we're considering things like this. But personally, sometimes as an author, it feels a little bit like a landmine. I mean, I suppose it's why we have beta readers and diversity readers, and why we go through so much before the point where our novel is sitting on a bookshelf. But I don't know. I think that's a fantastic question. I'd be interested in what everyone else says.
Yeah, I also want to bring up for the people who are going to be watching this that I acknowledge that we are a panel of white male-presenting individuals, so that is something we have to take into account into our answers. If we had someone who was, I am non-binary, but if there's someone who was a female-presenting individual or a person of color, they might have a different approach to this, just presenting that to the audience. Jessie and Andy?
I mean, I was thinking of saying something very similar to what you just said, in that, sometimes systems can be an enemy, and the system for WriteHive is great because it's crowdsourcing writers, but in this case, one of the weaknesses it had was that we weren't able to get more people that would represent a more diverse viewpoint. But with that said, when you talk about punishing villains, I'm going to take it back to Mercedes Lackey again. She wrote one of my favorite villains ever, and I can't give you his name because he's got a few of them because he's lived a few different lives. He's pretty good at stealing bodies after he dies. So every time he pops up, oh no, this is going to get really bad because he's really bad. And by that, I mean not subtle at all. Lots of assault, lots of murder, lots of everything in between. And the only way to stop him ends up being literal divine intervention, which I don't mind for a villain that bad. Usually when God comes down and does the Deus Ex Machina slap, it seems contrived, but when you're up against somebody that powerful with that much to work with, and they've been built up for long enough that they feel substantial, you've gotten inside of this villain's head and seen how they think, well, then that's a different story. Once you know what they're working with and it's within the same network of systems, and I almost want to call it gameplay, but it's not, then it makes a little more sense that, yep, this was the necessary step, and this was the next one up.
The whole concept of redemption versus sort of execution, final punishment is one that is such an incredibly complex topic that every single outcome done right is going to be different. Every character, every villain, every antagonist, even the heroes, the consequences of their action, every time that we as authors pen it into a story, we frame it in a way that says that, hopefully the readers can say, yes, I agree with that being the right outcome for them. That's the right way to have handled that. Or that's a punishment for their specific situation that I can agree with. Now, we are far from, legislators, so it's not our place to say, the right way to handle this. But I feel like every chance that we get to show the better side of humanity, whether even through, I write dark-ass fantasy, dark shit, but every chance I get to show sort of humans being better than who they were before, I feel like it's my, artistic obligation is to show that, because at the end of the day, I want people to walk away from my stories feeling like no matter how bad things are, the world's going to get a bit better. So I try to do that. Now, do my villains and antagonists end up dead? Yeah, probably more often than in prison. But that's the nature of the stories that I write. And it's the way that I craft the outcome of the characters, and I make them evil enough that by the end of the book, the reader's like, kill him or her, obviously, But there's so many different ways to do it, and every situation is so unique. So people like legislators who have to find sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to these different crimes and punishments. It's an incredibly complex job that we as authors will never really appreciate unless we, join the bar and become a Supreme Court justice kind of thing. But then, when it comes to representation, commenting and making observation on representation, we have the freedom as people, humans, to write that into our stories whatever way we want. We also have sort of the obligation as decent human beings to treat it with respect, to treat someone else's problem with respect. I may be a white cisgender hetero male, but I can still write about things that are outside of my realm of expertise by talking with people and getting information from them, asking them. Now, I'm thinking about crafting this character who shares some traits in common with you. If you were seeing yourself represented on the page, how would you want to be portrayed? What would you like a reader reading this to know? And doing that, I think, is a way for us as authors to tell a story or to share a morality as, you know, as different as when is it okay to kill. I'm pretty sure none of us can ever have, or we're never going to come face to face with that question. So we may never come face to face with a lot of other things, but we can still write about it. We can still tell a story that shows people, hey, there is this way, this possible means of dealing with this X situation and coming out of it with a positive outcome.
I find it very interesting what you're all saying. You all are very intelligent people, which is a wonderful thing to have in this conversation. I find it really interesting when those kinds of issues are presented in fiction, and the way it is presented is usually what I find to be the issue. What you were talking about before, Andy, about respect and the way it needs to be brought up with respect. I also find within the world of the fiction, the way you address it presents a certain problem. Like if someone says something sexist or something racist and it is not addressed as an issue within the world of the text, is that an endorsement or is that a fictional liberty that you're taking? I guess the way that you present that and develop that throughout the story.
Well, I think the way that you develop that, especially from the perspectives of the protagonist, antagonist, because the truth is that there is always going to be racism, sexism, you know, all of those things in the world, right? That's always going to exist. Whether we personally condone it or not, there's going to be some asshole at the coffee shop who mouths off. There's going to be someone, you know, saying something condescending on TV, right? So it exists inside the world independent of us, which means it exists inside the fictional worlds independent of the characters. Now, when the main character, the one who has all the agency in the story, comes face to face with it and does not respond to it, then yes, in a way, it's a subconscious signal that this is okay, or we don't have a problem with this. So as authors, it's kind of harder than most people expect, but you kind of have to look at your stance on these things. And then if you're going to write them into the story, you have to, number one, be able to write your stance into the character, and number two, defend that. If you actually believe a certain way. If someone says, oh, you know, I don't believe that you should do this, right? Whether they're saying, I don't believe in Adam and Steve or Adam and Eve should be the only one, or whatever it is, you have to defend your stance to whoever it is. Now, there are going to be people who are just absolutely bigoted, and you can be like, yeah, I'm not really going to defend my stance to you. Whereas people who are, you know, that kind of person that you're representing on the page, if you disrespect them, or if you don't portray the character doing things in a way that is respectful to them, then you are absolutely going to have to defend that. And as artists, I think it's our responsibility to have to do that. When we're putting ourselves out there, we have to say, yes, here is why I believe what I believe, and take the flack that comes with it.
Yeah, I'd love to comment on that from a personal experience too, because you're absolutely right. It's when your hero comes into contact with these things where you really run into the most opportunity and danger in these issues you've presented in your world. One of the things that when I set out to start being a writer, I'm gay, so having gay characters be intrinsic to the foreground of the world and without the novel being about the characters being gay was important to me. And I thought, here I was, Mr. Diversity, by doing a science fiction novel in which I have most of the main characters who happen to be gay. And first novel comes out, and all of a sudden I'm seeing all this feedback about, well, that's great, but what about people of color? And what about the treatment that you gave to woman characters and lesbians and the other spectrum on the gay community? So my own learning experience with that was influenced by the fact that because I wrote my novel in first person and it's from the perspective of, quote, the hero of the novel, everything in that novel I wrote, I had to own every single thing because he interacted with every single thing from his point of view. And I had to learn from that. And I actually made adjustments in book 2 and will continue for the rest of my series specifically around that, because it was important to me. If I'm really creating a hero, I want him to act heroic. And those were things that I'd left off the table that I could have had an impact on.
And the truth is that as people, we're never going to get everybody right. You know,
Right.
our experience is so limited within, you know, the 360-degree radius that we can see. So when we meet someone new, I mean, how much do you know about the people from Central Africa? I couldn't tell you anything about them. I could tell you a lot about Japan, but the Japanese culture isn't my story. I was born there, but it's not my story to tell. My wife's from Argentina. I could tell you 5 things about them, but would I know enough to write them realistically? No. Now, if I want to write an Argentine character, I'm going to have to learn about them. So writing gives us a chance to learn about all of these characters, just like we, the author, are sharing these characters with the readers. First, we have to understand them properly in order to write them in a way that's realistic and a way that is genuine to the humanity of people who share the world with us, that have those specific characteristics or traits or nationalities or sexualities or genders or whatever it is.
Yeah, so I just want to go back to what Katie was saying about opportunity versus danger. And I think, first of all, props on you for taking the opportunity to learn. And your character also has the opportunity to learn, because if your character is a hero, where did your hero go wrong in the past and whatever. But I also want to tie it to setting, because your setting is going to be essential as a writer into what determines what a hero even is. I mean, if your setting is, you know, God forbid, the Civil War, your hero might by nature be bigoted because that's how most people were at the time, and to not represent that honestly, to create some sort of paragon who's 2 centuries ahead of their time, might do damage to the very idea of the history that was lived by so many people there. It's like, no, there wasn't that guy there doing anything. Some people were doing it on their own, if you know what I mean. You know, black people had to help themselves. They didn't have that much help. Or if they did, even the people trying to end slavery were oftentimes still very racist, still very interested in bigoted ideas. They just only moved forward so much. They just wanted an end to this particular system because maybe another system might benefit them. So opportunities to learn exist for characters, just like the publishing is an opportunity as well as a danger. Like, yeah, you're putting yourself out there. And again, props to you for doing that, because that's not easy. It's not easy to publish your first book. It's not easy to take that feedback and be like, oh, wow, I messed up. I did something wrong. And hey, I'm going to learn, because that's what your hero needs to do now. And I'm sure your hero is going to do just fine with that.
I think you all make really, really awesome points. I wanted to add one thing, that because we're writing about fictional worlds, you don't necessarily always have to address these topics, which I think is something that a lot of people not necessarily forget, but they feel obligated to address them. You are able to create a world in which homophobia and racism, sexism does not exist, because at the end of the day, fiction is fiction. It doesn't have to necessarily be real. There can be other problems that people face, but that doesn't necessarily have to be one of them. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Can I just build on something for a second?
Yeah, go for it.
I just want to point out, since I think I probably should have mentioned this earlier myself, if you're familiar with the idea of coding, when you take something that's realistic and you code it into something fictional so that there's an example of racism in your world where there are no races that we're familiar with because they're all aliens, they all have 6 eyes. That can be, again, an opportunity or a danger. You know, if you do it right and respectfully and you get sensitivity readers in and you make sure that you're doing things in a fair way, that could be a good way to demonstrate the harms that have been done to real people without having to get too personal so that people are injured by it themselves and they experience that stuff secondhand. But if you do it poorly, then you're going to end up just making yourself look like a fool probably, and earning yourself some negative feedback and maybe even really hurting people yourself.
I think that was a good addition. I think that was a really good point to make. So with these things, we were talking about like sympathy before. Things like this, it's very hard to make a villain who does these things sympathetic. It's very hard to make an anti-hero who does these things sympathetic. How do you go about making an anti-hero, or even if it's not your point of view character, your villain, sympathetic? Like, we could go with the example of Magneto, where there are a lot of people, possibly me included, that Magneto was right. Magneto has every reason to feel the way that he feels. And the way that his argument is presented, you can understand it and you can sympathize for him. How do you guys go about doing that in your own writing?
Well, the one thing I've found in my research over the last few years is that there's really only 3 unforgivable sins. The first one is injury or like abuse of pets, animals, right? Horses, dogs. If you're going to kill that horse in a battle scene, it damn well better be a good reason why you're doing it, or your readers are going to be up in arms. Same as, it's called the kick the dog moment, because any villain who kicks the dog is immediately a bad guy, right? Children, same thing. Abuse to violence against any sort of evil directed at children. Most readers will never forgive that, except for there are a few cases like Jaime Lannister, right? By the end of 8 seasons, people had kind of forgotten that he'd shoved Bran out the window. Now, Bran survived, so it wasn't quite evil, but, so everything that he did. But then, usually like sexual assault.
My cat's meowing, sorry.
Is the third one. That because our culture right now does not forgive that. Once a character does that, whether it's directed at a woman, a man, non-binary, whatever it is, if there is some sort of sexual assault, that is a step too far that most readers will never allow the character to recover from. Everything else, they can come back from. There could be redemption. The fourth one is cowardice. Consistent cowardice. If the character never makes a choice to be brave, if they die a coward, then they are a coward forever and they will never be forgiven. Other than those 4 things, everything else can be forgiven. And so all that you have to do, it's going to sound super, super simple, and it comes down to like a lot of little steps and scenes, is that you make the character do something bad, however bad it is, as long as you don't cross over into those 4 cardinal sins. And then you just bring them back one small scene at a time. They make small choices, the right choice, time and again. They can keep making bad choices, but as long as by the end of the book, they've made enough right choices to sort of outweigh their initial action and all the bad choices they've made over the course of the story, then that is how you get the reader to sort of empathize with them and say, okay, they've earned their redemption. Whether it's for a hero or villain, it's just that good has to outweigh the bad a little bit. And there are so many things. Like, all you have to do is take all of the, the sort of the 7 cardinal sins, and those are the bad things, and then you take all of the good things that we as, humanity and society admire and respect, and those are all the good things, and just make them do more of that. And that's all it comes down to. And there's so many ways to go about it.
Yeah, that was, you just did a mic drop moment, I think. I don't know, everyone's just kind of...
A little bit.
Go.
No, Jesse, go.
All right, so I like your unforgivable sins list. I never forgave Jaime Lannister. I tried to, but then at the end he kind of just, became Jaime Lannister. He just stayed himself, and I was like, "Damn you fool!"
But you see, had he not made that choice, had he done
he had a potential
thing, exactly.
And I think that's it. I mean, when you look at the transition from good guy to bad guy, either way, I like your focus on incremental change, Andy. I think that's really important. Sometimes it's not always incremental. Sometimes it's big things. I mean, I'll bring it back to Berserk. If you're familiar with Griffith, you know where I'm going with this. This is a guy who seems to live a charmed life and everything's going his way, and it's great until they realize that he's boinking the princess, and maybe that's not so good for royal succession. So, yeah, he gets imprisoned, tortured, all that stuff. But his friends save him, and he's such a hero. They went out of the way to save him. He's the hero of the country, and he's still alive. He's just, up against the wall really bad. And after moments of weakness and after finally trying to be human and getting seen as nothing more than this idol, he does something unforgivable. I think unforgivable. We don't know yet because Muir is always on hiatus, but he brings down hell on earth because he might not even have known what he was getting himself into at the time, but when he's offered a choice between power that he's always craved and the ability, I guess, to return to his life as a shell, well, he decides to take power. So even though he's done a lot of things right, and it was only the little things that got him in trouble, in the end, he's presented with one big choice. He makes that choice, and the rest is, picking up with Guts being a crazy anti-hero.
Well, so that's something, is that evil is one big choice or even one small choice. That's all it takes to go into that realm. getting back to good, because we were talking about redemption. Redemption, you can never, like, it's never good enough for one big choice. Like, let's say the villain of the whole piece, at the end, he's like, fine, I'm going to stand here and I'm going to die to save, the main character from the evil god of the monsters. That is cheap. That is cheap redemption that no one buys. Now, if over the course of the whole series they've made small steps and then they make that choice, then it works. But all it takes to go into evil is one choice, and to get back to good is so many.
That's a really interesting just statement about human nature in general, about like our negativity bias, I suppose.
Well, it's like you look at people in jail. How many of them had a bad day and snapped? Or, they had one too many drinks and drove and hit someone and died and killed them, Like, all it takes is one thing, and you spend the rest of your life in jail. Right?
Like Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, one bad day.
Exactly. And so that's how easy it is to go from hero to villain. But getting back, that is what takes this Herculean effort of day after day, these little tiny accomplishments, these little tiny steps of progress. That's what makes it feel real. You can try to go for the massive grand gesture of redemption, but everyone's going to call it bullshit if it's someone who's been a villain his whole time. It's like, wait a minute, there's some other villainy coming behind this, and then when it doesn't, it feels weird. So to get them back to the good side, it's going to take a lot of little things, and then maybe one big thing to sort of push them back into that 51% category. But it's got to have all those little things to build that foundation, because no one changes fundamentally overnight.
Yep.
You say we talk about villains and you're petting your cat. I think that's just very funny.
She's like, I want attention, Daddy. So this is Ophelia, and she's now part of the broadcast, and she likes pets, and pets are heroic.
Save the cat.
You really, before this is over, you have to do the spin around with the petting thing. Hello, Mr. Bond. You have to do that. It's there.
Well, hello, Andy. How are you?
Incredible. I think this is beautiful. So I find it really interesting. This conversation has been really, really wonderful. We're down to our last 8 or so minutes. I want to talk a little bit about how 50 or so years ago, maybe a little bit before that with the invention of noir, we wouldn't have been having this conversation. The idea of good and evil was very black and white. We started this conversation talking about that shades of gray. What do you think this means on a cultural scale, our cultural obsession with the anti-hero, with seeing these people who we perceived as bad because of some things they do actually have this shimmering aspect of goodness shine through them, that they are redeemable? What do you think that means to you in reflection of the world?
Well, I have to point out that there was Conan, there was Elric, there were people who've been around for a while who played anti-hero. So it's the obsession may be fairly new, but its existence has been around a while.
That's true.
I mean, I suppose I would answer the question from the perspective of what I am, which is a storyteller. And one of the, I've spent a lot of my life studying diversity. I used to be a diversity consultant. And one of the things you learn about diversity in particular is that, and I'm applying this to the idea of having more nuanced villains and heroes and more shades of gray, is that your entire perspective of how you grew up and what you see and what you go through on a daily basis is imagine a 10% cone, and by a cone of vision, and then by suddenly entertaining these different storylines and different ways of thought and being, all of a sudden that 10%, it increases by 20, 30, 40%. You have these set amount of stories that you've always heard in that cone of 10%. And then all of a sudden you're expanding your scope, allowing for different types of heroes, different types of villains, or even we didn't even touch on heroes, the different type of heroes we have and what sort of baggage they come with, whether it be external or internal, or what challenges they face in their life. But by opening the options of what you bring to the table as a storyteller, there is so much unexplored territory out there. It's like being an adventurer 400 years ago when we hadn't even mapped the planet, or more than 400 years. But that's my perspective. I mean, that's what I find beautiful about it, and what my personal belief is in these shades of gray and the anti-heroes and having more nuanced villains is that it gives me the chance to tell a million different stories that you wouldn't have been able to about 50 years ago.
I love the use of the term unexplored territory, and I think... Oh, I'm getting an echo. I think that's got to do with it. I think that... where was I? My brain just failed. I think that with unexplored territory, we're starting to get more of it now. We're starting to learn as a society how the systems that we live in work, so that we're becoming a little more interested in the anti-hero, because sometimes the anti-hero is against the system. Sometimes it's that person who's got the choice to steal the medication that'll save a life. And we're living through that kind of crisis right now. God's help us all. And so as a result, we're more interested in seeing a character who's going to fight against that system, fight against what established structures exist. And that brings you to a more noir-centric place. My character, Emmett Eisenberg in Physics Incarnate, he's billed as kind of a hero, and I guess I'll give you guys a little teaser as to what I'm going to do with book 3. But you're going to realize, he is sort of not a hero. He's not a paragon of virtue. He's got a lot of flaws to him. And they're flaws that are sometimes societally imposed on him, and sometimes just plain old hey, you took advantage of people that you shouldn't have. And you also tried to kind of blow up the world. And maybe you shouldn't have done that.
Maybe you shouldn't have.
Yeah. Not always a good idea. In response to that question, I think it's largely down to the information age. Access to the internet has given us so much more of access to information, right? And which means everybody just knows more about more things than they did probably in the days when these books were first coming out. So now, let's say a small subsection of society has shown interest in psychology. Well, there's a shit ton of information on psychology available, which means, hey, I'd like to learn more about schizophrenia. Hey, I do some diving, some deep diving. I wonder if there's any books, novels showing me characters who have that, so I can sort of learn a little bit about them. And so having all of this information about all of the complexity of human nature, we're learning about the cultures across the world because we see articles about them or videos about them, or hell, YouTubers doing stupid shit in that country. The more we learn about everyone around us, the more we realize there's so much about them that we don't know. So all of this complexity is forcing us to confront, holy shit, the world is a much more complex place. The people around me are much more complex. So let's get into that complexity. And that's exactly what anti-heroes are, in a way that heroes may never be. Someone who has been trained his entire life to make the right choice. They've been, raised in the fantasy version of whatever the church is. They've been trained as a knight, learning all those noble virtues. And they've heard it. It's been ingrained into them. When it comes time to make that heroic sacrifice, of course they're going to do it. It's not even a guesstimate. It's expected of them because it's what they've got to do. Now, what about someone who's been beaten every day of their lives, or lived on the streets, had to steal for a living, had to kill, whatever the case is, put them in the realm of more villain anti-hero, and then throw them that same choice at them. That becomes a lot more interesting. And in a way, it becomes a lot more real, because no one is, like you guys were saying, the paragons of society. There is no such thing as a paragon of society in our world. And it's very, very rare to find someone who's full-on Charles Manson level villain. We are seeing, thanks to this massive amount of information at our fingertips, that there are way more people in between the two than there will ever be in the realm of hero or villains. So we want to learn about those people because, hey, that's us. That's us right there. We are anti-heroes in so many ways. Maybe we lean a little bit more towards the heroic side, or I don't know about you guys, but, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is look for this sense of connection and understanding with the people around us. So by reading these more complex, nuanced characters, we understand them, and through them, other people who also connect with them in a way. So it's sort of like this way to bridge the gap between us and the author, and us and fellow readers.
Wow.
Yeah.
This was a really fantastic chat, guys. I really am glad that we were able to do this. And I'm sure the audience watching this is going to be thrilled by all of the practical information that you all gave, because this is a concept that's a little bit hard to wrap your head around and very easy to do poorly. So thank you all for joining me today. This was awesome.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
the blast.